All right, everybody, I think we're ready to get started. We'll be running the slideshow again, so if you missed some of that, that's all right. I'd like to welcome everybody to this celebration of the life of Kevin Mandery Cameron. Most of you probably know me. I'm Tom Mills. I went to high school and college with Kev. I was his teammate rowing for 8 years, college roommate, and he was the best man at my wedding, and I at his. And he'd probably want me to point out to you also that at some point in high school, he claims I broke his nose playing basketball. I want to start this by saying on behalf of all his roommates, teammates, and friends, how sorry I am to his family, his parents, Peggy and Bill, see them, his sister Karen is there, Pat, all Kev's nieces and nephews, and of course, his girls, his 2 daughters, Nell and Jane, and his wife, Carrie. I know we're all struggling to find our footing without Kevin, but certainly no one more than his family members. So we're gonna have a number of his family members speak tonight and his friends. And it's a Zoom meeting, so feel free, everybody, to use the chat message, and you can leave messages for Kevin's family, and you can message yourselves directly back and forth. And we'll show the slideshows once we're through, and we'll keep Zoom going another at least half an hour or so for people who want to keep sending messages to each other or leaving messages. So in her own way, as tough as Kevin and a tenacious woman, a word she likes, Carrie was married to Kevin for more than 22 years. So I'll hand over to Carrie.
Thanks, Tom. So Nell, Jane, and I want to thank the roommates, Tom, Jim, Adrian, and Pete, for gathering us all together to celebrate Kevin. We've received so many messages of love and support and generous offers to deliver dinner and lift heavy things, many, many offers of lifting heavy things. It was a difficult year and made more so by COVID. Kevin began having complicated surgeries in February and March, and everything was put on hold when hospitals canceled what they felt were elective procedures. But the silver lining to the year, which I called our Corona bonus, was our daughters returning home in March to spend most of Kevin's last year here together, doing the things that Kevin could still do, which included lots of ice cream, chips and salsa, and rewatching all the Harry Potter movies. Kevin wasn't able to travel, and there were a few days in September when it seemed like he was well enough that he could be home mostly alone, and I was able to get away, manage a project that we had started in South Carolina. So one night, our daughter Jane sent a text in the group chat between Nell, Jane, and myself, and it was a selfie of Kevin. He was wearing a helmet, and his motorcycle was in the background, and he was standing out in front of Home Depot. And she wrote, "Does anyone else know about this?" So I immediately called him and I said, "What are you doing riding a motorcycle?" And he replied in his Kevin way of avoiding the obvious, "I'm buying trash bags for the bathroom. The ones you bought smell weird." So Kevin knew that this year was not going his way, and he did everything he could to be true to himself, to create truly Kevin moments. And even if that meant making all of us crazy. So I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight to remember Kevin and to share our love for him.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm reminded that I think back when Kevin was living in New York right after college, I think his main diet was chips and salsa. So glad to know that was consistent. So next we'll be hearing from Kevin's older sister, Karen, who's there in Seattle with her parents. I just want to say she told me a story today of visiting Kevin at college, and at some point she was standing next to some girl she didn't know, and mentioned that she was Kevin's sister. And the girl looked at her kind of awestruck and said, "Kevin Cameron, he's so hot." And she reacted as any good older sister would. She said, huh, are you kidding? And that'll be the last thing I say about Kevin's status as a sex symbol tonight. Karen, go ahead.
Okay. So January 15th, 2002, I was sitting in a meeting. My phone went off, glanced down, my mother, quickly cut off the call. Phone went off again. Rinse and repeat again and again. And finally one of the guys said, you need to get that. Peggy was, to use another one of Carrie's favorite words, distressed. AML, acute myeloid leukemia. And my mom just couldn't get it out of her head that only the good die young. I went, Mom, no worries there. Kevin is a New York City investment banker. But I, like Kevin, fully believed he would beat it. We've always been of the same mind, not identical, but as some have said, two sides of the same coin. Haven't cried all day, so hold on just a bit. So flashback to the 1988-89 World Tour. Kevin was just out of college. I'd quit my job and already been traveling for a few months. And we met up in Tahiti. Went on to the Cook Islands, Fiji, and New Zealand, where we hitchhiked from top to bottom. Queenstown on the south end of the South Island is an adrenaline junkie paradise and the birthplace of bungee jumping. And Kevin happily forked over, which was a huge sum of money, to swan dive off the 43-meter high Kawaro Bridge to full body submersion in the river below while I played photojournalist. We had a near drowning experience river rafting, and Kevin got himself into some other near death debacle, but fortunately I missed that one. From there we split off. I ended up back in Auckland at a hostel we'd previously stayed, and I walked in fresh off the tramping trails, and this guy looked at me and tilted his head and said, Karen Cameron? And I went, yeah. And he said, your mother called. Peggy once again was distressed. Kevin had been working in Australia's Sydney Harbor for Dennis Conner and the US America's Cup team. He'd been bitten in the leg by a poisonous spider and was in hospital under threat of amputation. I jumped on a plane, but by the time I got there, he'd been discharged, pumped full of antibiotics, but leg intact with multiple concentric circles, a black marker covering angry, swollen skin. We toured the East Coast before splitting off again. Highlight was a spectacular week sailing the Great Barrier Reef and what we called yo-yo scuba diving, pushing the dive tables to the absolute limits. Fast forward to Perth, Australia, Australia's west coast. I'm checking into a guest house and looking through the register, there it is, and the relatively neat signature of Kevin M. Cameron. And I'm just like, no way, no way. Is this guy still here? And Adrian particularly, forgive me here, but he goes, tall, blonde, broken arm. I went, he was upstairs in a sling. He'd actually dislocated his elbow playing goalie for a local soccer team. We ended up renting a car and touring the West Coast. And ecological disaster aside, the highlight was this massive coal mining operation. They'd literally cut a mountain in half, and spanning the entire cross section was this horizontal ribbon of jet black coal, like 20, 30 yards thick. And strewn across this dugout landscape was the complete collection of yellow Tonka toys, except giant, like ginormous, for ginormous giants. And the miners, gruff and suspicious at first, ended up giving us the full tour, driving us in the monster trucks, letting us drive the monster trucks, plonking hard hats on our heads and taking us deep into the mine. This is Australia. Even offering us food and beer at the breaks. So anyway, great times. But back in Perth, I'm putting gas into the rent-a-car before we return it. Kevin jumps into the driver's seat to watch the needle as it goes up. And Kevin had realized after driving off the lot originally that the tank wasn't quite full, and he was insisting that we return it not quite full. And I was saying, you know, if there was an issue, we should have taken care of it back at the beginning, but we didn't. Now we risk getting into some ugly American tussle with our Australian toast over $5 or $6, seriously. And they'll probably charge it for us for it anyway. So I filled the tank. Kevin reimbursed me for his half, including the extra $3, but he was mad. And I wasn't going to last long as a traveler if I wasted money like that and let people rip me off. By that evening, we were yelling and swearing at each other from opposite sides of a public park. And we split off, and we didn't see or communicate with each other for nearly a year, a record to that day and since. When I landed in Seattle, Kevin was at the airport. We took one look at each other and burst out laughing. At that point, I was heads on the coin, the more experienced older sister with infinitely more common sense. But it didn't take long before the coin flipped. And Kevin became heads. The driver, you know, the motivator, the wise and rational problem solver, the loving and compassionate caretaker, the guy with so many ideas. God, I promised myself. The guy with so many ideas of what he could achieve and contribute. Executive function eventually caught up with the risk taking, but never really tempered it, nor the willingness and toughness to endure its consequences. And I became tails, just scrambling to keep up. I do not know quite how I'm going to walk this planet without him on it. But I do know one thing. Even if the metaphor doesn't hold up, I am keeping the coin. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. One thing I'm thinking about, we both kind of planned a world tour together. He ended up leaving before me, and I never quite caught up to him. So we were never, we were on the road at the same time, but never in the same place. And hearing some of those stories, I guess maybe I'm better off for that. I didn't have nearly as many accidents as he did. Someone else who knew Kevin, almost from the time he was born, I guess from the time he was about 4 months old, was family friend and neighbor at the time when they were young. Amy Woodruff, she also went to Lakeside High School with us. She was a year older than Kevin and I. Amy, go ahead.
Wow. So Karen really made me cry. But as Tom said, my family moved into the neighborhood where the Camerons lived when I was 4 months old, before Kevin was born. And Karen and my sister became fast friends and remain so to this day. And so my mom and Peggy were also very close friends, and we spent a lot of time with the Cameron family. When either set of parents would go on holiday, the Cameron kids would come to our house, or my sister and I would go to their house and be looked after by their respective parents. And then we also went on a lot of holidays together when we were young, to Hawaii mostly. And there was also a rather adventurous holiday to California in a big white van back in the 70s. I think Kevin was probably in about 4th grade. I can't remember, but it was his 2 sisters, my sister, and the moms, and Kevin, the only boy in the group. So it was a wild ride in the van, and I know that Kevin had 1 or 2 meltdowns because you can't win against 5 other girls. You can't win every battle. So the one thing I do remember about Kevin is he was fairly quiet and kind of an observer. I would say, much as I thought about it, much like his dad. and he was just sort of there. And so when Tom asked me to speak, I reached out to some other people that we grew up with, and spoke to a guy named Chris Erickson, whose family also had a cabin up on Whidbey Island. And Chris had said that he had spent a lot of time with Kevin on the beach on Whidbey Island, building driftwood forts, the bigger the better. And he said that Kevin was smart, creative, and he knew he would be a really amazing person as he moved through his life. And he said that it was really amazing to see how he was thoughtful and caring, and he really treated people like he wanted to be treated. And that's kind of how I saw Kevin also. That's exactly how I saw Kevin. And I think about when people say, when you're struggling or you're stressed or you have issues, that people say, well, find the helpers. And I really think Kevin was like a helper. When I went through some medical issues, he was one of the first people I called and just said, I'm going to be on these immunosuppressant drugs. What's it like? And he told me all about it, what to expect, where to have a surgeries. He sent doctors out to do research for questions I had. I know my sister had a good friend in Portland who was dealing with some pretty serious cancer. And Kevin and my sister were in conversation constantly about her issues, this woman's issues. And he was just always there to be helpful to anybody who needed help, whether he knew them or not. I was living and working overseas at one point, and I called Kevin or I reached out to Kevin because I had a friend Australian friend whose daughter was suffering with a bad brain tumor, and Kevin was happy to help me out with that. So it's just interesting because he is a helper and he cares, but he's, from my side, he was quiet and reserved, but I know that his roommates and his rowing buddies and other people who knew him in college probably saw his rowdier side. Like Karen was saying, the adventure side and the crazy, do wild things, get bit by poisonous spiders in Australia side of Kevin. So it's hard to think that he's not here anymore for everybody. And I know it's been a hard year for people, and he's an amazing person, and he'll always be in my heart. So that's it.
All right, thanks, Amy. And I just want to say, I know you went to Hawaii often, and we were just talking a few days ago, and that was actually the first time I met Kevin. We barely remember it. He remembers it better than I do. When we were about 8, he'd taken a mutual friend, Stuart Thiem, with him, and I knew Stuart. So, and Kevin's memory of that time we first met was that I was kind of an annoying little jerk who all I wanted to do was do swim races in the swimming pool, and he was, cooler than that. So then I don't think we met again until high school. Then in high school, Kevin started rowing freshman year, and our coxswain, Catherine DeForest, who will speak next, she pointed out that she undoubtedly spent more time each day looking at Kevin than anyone else did during the season, probably including his parents. She was our coxswain, and Kevin was rowing stroke, so she spent a lot of time staring at him. Catherine?
Hey, thanks, Tom. Kevin was a dear friend. He was a classmate, he was a teammate, and in a lot of ways, he was like a brother. High school is, the high school years, make a huge imprint on who we later become. And we go in as maybe geeky and awkward and nervous 14-year-olds, and we come out 4 years later and we have a better sense of our self-identity. And along the way, it's our friends who help shape that. And in high school, you spend so much more time with your friends than you do your family. It becomes your whole life. And, Kevin was right alongside me and the rest of us as we went through all those life events, like, you know, getting our driver's licenses and going on wilderness death marches and going to our first formal dances and defending our philosophy papers and applying for college and all that stuff, all the highs and the lows. And Kevin was always a part of that. Most of all, though, we put in time together on the water. And Lakeside's crew team in the 80s was really unique and I think magical. There were 100 kids on the team at its peak, and that's about 25% of the school. And I don't think I can think of any sports program in any school that has that kind of impact on the community. Boys and girls and everybody goes in with no experience, or at least back then they didn't. You all start on the same page, and you know, it was hard work. And we were rowing on Lake Washington. There were big waves and freezing rain. The only weather that would stop us from going out was lightning. Seaplanes were landing. Once in a while, you'd hit a duck or a dead rodent in the slough. The dock was sinking. Our feet were wet. I remember being freezing all the time. We had no bathrooms on site. There was no electricity, but we had these amazing coaches and we had each other. And again, it was a lot of work, but it was super rewarding. And I can't think of anybody I would want to go through that more than Kevin. The stroke seat is a special one in the boat. Every seat matters. But in the stroke, you're looking for somebody like Kevin, who's definitely strong, but also has a desire to do whatever it takes to win. Because if the stroke doesn't believe that you can win, then you're not going to be the first across the finish line. And Kevin was fearless and he was stoic. He was the perfect leader for that position. He was also calm and so cool on the starting line. You know, I look at him in the eyes and I knew we were, you know, locked and loaded and ready to go. And that no matter what happened during the race, Kevin would be leading us and he'd just be steady and consistent and totally dependable the way he was in everything that he did. And we won a lot. I hope that doesn't sound like bragging, but it was so much fun. And I don't know if it was Kevin or Tom who talked about winning by curvature of the earth, meaning there was so much space between us and second place that you could you could see the curve of the earth. A little bit of an exaggeration. Off the water, Kevin was, you know, if he was all work on the water, off the water, he was goofy. He had a crazy laugh and he was quick to use it. We had a new racing shell. I don't know what its official name was. Usually it's named after some famous alum, but he nicknamed it the Goonie Goo Goo. And that was the name that stuck. It was based on, Tom just explained to me now that it was based on some Eddie Murphy skit that I wasn't allowed to watch when I was little because there were too many swear words. But that was Kevin's sense of humor, just crazy. And he loved to banter, and you know, one-upsmanship was what he was all about. But he was just super sweet and thoughtful and approachable. I think everybody on the team felt comfortable with him, just a super likable guy. He was humble. He didn't need to be humble. I mean, he had so much to be proud of. He was so athletic and so smart and so good looking. But he didn't take himself too seriously. And that was something I really appreciated and loved about him. One little story I wanted to share was in the summer of 1984, right after we graduated. I got a letter from Kevin, and I had just been cut from the tryout team for the women's junior national team. And Within, I think, an hour of finding out, Kevin wrote me a letter, a handwritten letter, because we didn't have any electronic options back then. And these are the words that he said, and I think give you a sense of the strength that he had for the things that were to face him in the future. He said, "I wish I had some great words of comfort to say to you, but I don't. I only hope that you don't take it too hard. It's one of those things that you give it your best shot and see what happens. You gave Sweden a shot and unfortunately you missed. Now you have the choice of handling the situation any way you like. Be happy. Don't let this or anything else limit you. If you don't let it, it won't." These are my great philosophical words to you. So thank you, Kevin, for those words and all those great memories. And, on behalf of all those people that you touched in high school, you definitely made your imprint on us. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. That sounded like the wisdom of about 120-year-old. And by the way, I don't think you were exaggerating when you say we won a lot. I don't think we ever lost. And the older I get, the more I think that. So I'd like to tell a little story about high school, and it has nothing to do with high school itself. So Kevin and his family lived on Lake Washington, and every summer, certainly after sophomore year or so, I would drive down early in the morning, about 5:30, probably before it was light. Or just about every morning, I'd drive down and we'd go water skiing. But there were times if it was raining or sometimes I just didn't wake up, and Kev would get up and get ready to go, and then I wouldn't be there, and he'd be kind of angry and go back to sleep. So he, being practical or possibly being lazy, he decided he was no longer going to get up unless I actually showed up, and I had to stand outside in his backyard, yelling up to the second floor bedroom that he was in, trying to wake him up. And I'd get louder and louder. And eventually his mom would wake up and walk over to his bedroom and sort of shake him awake. She's fairly tolerant of us high school kids, but that was obviously not going to be sustainable. So the solution he came up with was before he went to sleep, he would tie a rope around his foot and he'd put it out the window. And so when I showed up, assuming I showed up, I would start pulling on this rope. And the first few times I couldn't see what was happening. So I was pulling pretty hard and apparently just pulled him and his bed across the room and almost out the window. But we eventually got that worked out better. And I'm just, I'm trying to think, we must have, and then between high school and college, I'm sure we skied, well over 100 times, 100 mornings. And I know some of you water skiers are probably thinking, wait, 2 people, you need a spotter to be legal. And we would occasionally use his dog Mink was a pretty good spotter. So that's the memories I have of Kevin from high school. So next we have another one of Kevin's college roommates, Pete Robertson. Pete.
Thanks, Tom. The 4 of us who roomed with Kevin the longest in college, Tom, Jim, Adrian, and me, I'm the one whose path crossed least with him in the years since we graduated. But one of the many gifts of who Kevin was that it didn't matter. We only saw each other every few years, most recently about 16 months ago, when, despite his health challenges, he flew himself to DC and scootered to the church for my father's memorial service. But the old familiar friendship was always instant, no matter how much time had passed or what else was going on. And yeah, getting together involved stories. Me, the time I was on the losing end of the backgammon game, doubling cube folly that required me to do 8 vodka shots. Me on the receiving end of 40 gallons of cold water he dumped in my shower. My elaborate forgery of a disciplinary letter to Kevin from the Elliott House head tutor that backfired on me. The police seizure of our unlicensed Head of the Charles t-shirts, etc. But what always mattered most when we got together was Kevin's gentle and compassionate interest in me, in my family, in everyone else, and in later years in the lower aviation fuel prices at some lesser known airports. But I doubt I would have been lucky enough to be his friend in college if we hadn't been roommates. As others are already attesting and will attest, he gave his all to crew while I was off with a liberal political journal. On the surface, our politics differed and we had the usual late night college dorm room debates. I remember especially a debate about Greenmiller or T. Boone Pickens' visit to campus. But he never really accepted the social Darwinism of the 80s. He was too compassionate and too fair and too interested in people to buy all of that. When Kevin was an investment banker, I didn't see much of the Masters of the Universe theater up close, but I remember him scoffing that a colleague's narratives about financial deals likened those deals to the landing at Iwo Jima. I remember him lamenting that in conversations at work, politics always fell away as soon as he stopped bringing it up. And I remember his wondering about what the people cleaning the building would think if they really understood the difference in their salaries. I've often thought of Kevin as a modern Job. His incredibly courageous battle is over and we're left with our memories and stories. I personally regret that I didn't enjoy more of his company over the years since college and that I didn't get to see much of him closer up as a family man. But putting together the slideshow gave me a chance to see that he must have been every bit as great as I always imagined he was in that capacity, and as I was able to witness directly myself a few times along the way. And beyond that regret, I have only sorrow and gratitude. Gratitude for having been able to call him a friend, gratitude for his example of bravery and struggle against the dying of the light, and gratitude for his decency and compassion as a human being. I could not possibly know or count all of the many and indirect ways in which Kevin has left this world a better place, but I know he has. May his memory be for a blessing.
Thanks, Petey. And that reminds me, thank you everybody who sent in photos or uploaded them. And thanks, Pete, for putting that slideshow there. That's a great slideshow. And there are actually a lot of photos that didn't make it in. So we'll have to figure out what we do with those. So next we have Steve Wayne, who he rode with Kevin for 4 years at Harvard. And he's one of the few people I know that was willing to climb into Kevin's plane with him. So, Steve Wayne.
Thanks, Millsy. And also, Millsy, thanks for wearing your formal Hawaiian shirt today. I'm sure Kevin would appreciate that. KK, Cam, Mandery, Kev, LeCheval. There's a lot to say about Kev. But tonight I'm going to focus just on two things. Kevin was amazingly tough, and Kevin was delightfully mischievous. First, Kevin was tough. Most rowers are tough. You kind of really have to be to get to the level that Kevin achieved. But in rowing, toughness was measured in 6-minute races, 2-hour practices, and year-long seasons. And Kevin's tough, which he's proven over time, measured much more. Almost 20 years of pain, hardship, surgery, chemo, setbacks, resurgences, setbacks, and more resurgences. And Kevin always answered the call, no matter how big the challenge, how big the setback. It was awe-inspiring to watch. And I think like Kevin, I don't accept that cancer beat him. When Kevin was diagnosed, he told me that the doctor said he had a 10% 6-month survival rate. And that's what they said, at the beginning. So he was an underdog from the start. And my math might be a little wrong here, but I think in almost 20 years, I think Kevin put a 38-month stretch of beating the 6 months, despite the 10-year odds, almost 20 years. So when it comes to battling cancer, I don't think Kevin lost. I think he's 38-1, and I'm really proud of him for this. The other thing is those close to cancer know you don't fight it by yourself. You fight it as a couple, a family, a team, and not as a person. And Carrie, Jane, Nell, our condolences go out to you for your loss. We really feel terribly for you. And I also wanted to say on behalf of all those, including me, that love Kevin, our thanks and admiration go out to you today as the ones who fought Kevin's cancer as long and as fiercely as he did. We know that wasn't easy. And thank you. Second, Kevin was charmingly mischievous. For those who know his roommates at Harvard, Kevin literally had the keys to everything. When the movie Ghostbusters came out and there was a main character called the Key Master, I really thought upon the reveal it was going to be Kevin. He had keys to everything: the boathouse, Blodgett Pool, Suits on Heads, Harry Parker's launch, the football stadium, and I'm pretty sure all of our rooms. If it was fun and forbidden, Kevin had the keys to it. One late night when revisionist history tells me Kevin and I were studying together, I asked Kev if he wanted to go in the square and grab a slice of pizza. And he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. And minutes later, we're in the closed Elliott dining hall. Funnily, I knew it wasn't his first time there because as we walked through the dining room into the kitchen, there was Tom Mills cooking up some grilled cheese sandwiches. And Kevin said, "Millsy, I'll have the usual." Another time, as Millsy said, Kevin and I were going to go up to Jim Crick's wedding in Maine. Jim was our coxswain, and Kevin offered to fly us up in his airplane. For those who know Kevin, classic enough Kevin, like successful enough to own his own plane and talented and bold enough to fly it himself and not hire a pilot. Also cheap enough to, which is like another thing that I love about Kevin. But his legs weren't working super well at the time. He was having trouble feeling his feet on the ground. So I asked Kevin, do you think your feet are going to be well enough to like work the pedals? And Kevin, like in his classic like confidence and nonchalance, said no problem. So we headed off to Westchester, and we're sitting on the tarmac, and Kevin couldn't get the navigation system working, and classic Kevin poking it 5, 10, 20 times and then getting harder, like that was going to make a difference. And I started to lose a little confidence as he was slamming his navigation system with different fingers. And I started to rethink the prudence of flying with a sick pilot with limited use of his 2 feet, who was like self-proclaimed a little rusty on the flying after not having been in his plane for 6 months. But classic Kevin, intuitive, he feeling my fear, tasting my fear. He continued to poke the navigation system till he was right, it worked, and then went through his checklist and we took off. And about half an hour into the flight, I was just getting comfortable that we were going to survive, and all of a sudden the plane nose dived, and I look over and I see Kevin sleeping, and I panicked, yelled, and Kevin immediately pulled the plane back, and as he leveled out, he was howling with laughter. So Kevin, I would say Kevin laughed the whole flight, and that was Kevin. No opportunity for fun or a joke missed. I will admit I didn't really laugh until we were safely on the ground in Maine, but have to admit he totally got me. That was Kev. It was fun every step of the way, young or old, healthy or sick. Oh, miss scheming about the best ways to invest in Bitcoin or some crazy ski area in Vermont that Kevin wanted to buy. Hearing about Jane and Nell's latest exploits and achievements, and competitively racing our cars to launch in our middle-aged version of Greenwich NASCAR. The only upside I can think of Kevin's passing is that the streets of Greenwich are a lot safer. Kevin got sick too young and died too early. I think we can all agree on that. But most of us, all of us, will die eventually. And most of us will join Kevin in heaven. And for those that find the pearly gates locked when we don't arrive, don't worry. We all know a loyal, generous friend who I'm sure by now has already procured a secret set of keys. Thanks, Kev. You inspired us with your fight, your talents, great memories, the bend in your oar, the fun, and mostly just for your friendship. We love you, bud.
Thanks, Wayner. Thanks also for doing that from JFK and getting us the COVID announcements behind you, I think. Just a few things you mentioned, the Elliott House kitchen, after hours, there were times you went in there and a huge grill to grill grilled cheeses was, there would be a waiting list, a line of people waiting to get on it. So that was always a fun place to be. Cheap. You mentioned cheap. I was there in October, and he had a loaner Tesla. And I remember driving back with him, and going to plug the Tesla in, and he's like, "Don't charge that Tesla. I don't want to charge the loaner with my electricity." He was trying to run it down to zero before he turned it back in. And then flying, I was willing to fly with him, and we were going to fly down to Kiowa Island, and the night that I arrived there. I was in a diner waiting for him to get home, and he called me and said, were not going to be flying down in my plane. He was flying somewhere to buy cheap gasoline for the plane, and as he landed, he hit an osprey and dented the wings. So the flight was out. We had to fly commercial down to Kiowa. It was tragic. But thanks, Steve. Next, Jim Himes was another one of Kevin's college roommates, and he lives in Coscob, right next to Greenwich. And I think he probably saw Kev more regularly than a lot of, or most of Kev's college friends over the last couple of decades. So Jim Himes.
Thanks, Millsy, and thanks, Wayner, for those great words, and great to see you in your natural habitat and airport in the middle of a COVID pandemic. God, it is so wonderful to see so many friends and classmates and boatmates and family, and Carrie, you and the girls really are family. Some folks on the call may not know it, but we live just 3 miles from the Camerons, and our kids are the same age. So we all grew up together. And Peggy and Bill, you guys are absolutely family. Peggy, you became family that famous day in 1990 when you rescued me from that horrible, horrible date in Seattle. And that's not a story that's getting told tonight, but condolences from all of us. I want to tell you all, though, that the day we lost Kevin, the roommates, Adrian and Tom and Pete and I, we just got on an impromptu Zoom with Carrie and Nell and Jane, just 12 hours later. And we spent an hour smiling and laughing and drinking too much good scotch in Kevin's memory. But I keep reflecting on that. An hour, we just lost somebody so important to us, but it was one of the happiest hours because we were remembering what Kevin did, who he was, and what he meant to us. And I think because Kevin, it's coming through tonight as you listen to the people who knew Kevin best. Kevin just did it right. He wasn't the loudest voice in a room. He wasn't the most rambunctious. He just did it right. He had this quiet integrity, this competence. And I saw that when I met him in 1985, actually. In college, when he became my roommate sophomore year. Kevin and I were roommates and rode together, and we were in New York City together, and we migrated out to the suburbs here in Fairfield County, Connecticut, at roughly the same time. And I remember in 1985 meeting Kevin, and he was quiet. He was in the background. He had which, by the way, some of you don't know what freshman year was like. Steve Wayne, who you just heard, and Tim Ashford, who I thought I just saw, had just been released from an all boys school, Deerfield. So, I mean, I got to tell you, that freshman year with those two guys sort of hanging around with women for the first time was something to behold. You're going to hear from Mark Schoeffel, who was known as the Beast, and Tom Mills, need I say more? I mean, it just went on. And Kevin was the guy in the background, sort of acting as the conscience and the guy who had this quiet integrity in everything that he did, who reminded us as we were sort of rolling Viking-like over whatever was in front of us that, we ought to probably take care and be thoughtful and look out for the little guy, which didn't just mean the coxswain. But a couple of thoughts about why I think Kevin did it right. First of all, I got to tell you, when we lost Kevin, I was a little surprised. 20 years ago, when Kevin was diagnosed, as somebody said, he was not supposed to survive. And for 20 years, and I think everybody on this call knows this story, for 20 years, we went through these ups and downs. Carrie, of course, and the girls standing by him and working so hard and being so strong. But for 20 years, we just heard, oh God, it's gotten bad. It's gotten bad. And Kevin always pulled it out. He always beat it. I mean, it was almost a motto. It's bad, but Kevin, he's getting through this until last week. Kevin did it right because he lived life to the fullest. I think that was true before he was diagnosed 20 years ago. But as Steve said, you could see in his eyes, even if he didn't articulate it 20 years ago, that there was no way he was giving up on seeing his daughters become adults. And there was no way the odds favored him pulling that off. No way the odds favored it, but he did. And along the way, the guy became a pilot bought a motorcycle. You've heard that. He became a bicyclist. When he could no longer bicycle about 2 summers ago, for my birthday, he brought me his bike. I'm a little smaller than Kevin is, but he brought me his bike, because he just couldn't race anymore. And he gave it to me for my birthday, and he attached a rope, and on that rope was a boat anchor. And he said, if we're going to ride together, you're dragging this anchor. Kayaks, canoes, if you tour Kevin's house, his business career, which was unbelievable and exemplary, skiing in Vermont, water skiing at Todd's Point. Kevin lived it to the full. By the way, I have a plane story too, and I'll make it very, very quick, but everybody has a plane story if you flew with Kevin. And by the way, if you ever drove with Kevin, you thought twice about flying with Kevin, but Kevin would fly me back from Washington once in a blue moon. And one of the very first times I flew with him, we were coming in, we'd taken off in Washington, and it's a pretty easy flight until you get into New York airspace, where you've got Newark Airport, you've got Teterboro Airport, JFK, and LaGuardia. You have planes everywhere. And Kevin is making a real point. He's sort of, humble bragging a little bit about how pilots are so cool. And it goes back to Chuck Yeager. When you're communicating with the tower, it's all very crisp. You never ask for things to be repeated. You use a slight Oklahoma accent in homage to Chuck Yeager. And, he's all into this, how competent it is and how careful you are. And, he'd write everything down. Well, we're going through Newark airspace, and we start to turn around over the Hudson River once again to land at White Plains Airport. And there are planes everywhere. And I've got the things on, because if you flew with Kevin, you had the earphones on, and you got to listen in. And so his call sign, I can't remember what it was, but I remember he gets his instruction. His instruction is KRX 532 Delta 19er, go to 3 approach. And I hear Kevin repeat that. And then Kevin, about 10 seconds later, looks at me and says, hey, Jim, was that Delta approach or approach Delta 7? I said, I don't know, Kevin. I didn't write it down. Kevin, you're going to ask him, right? Kevin, you're going to ask him. Say, hey, Chuck Yeager. So I just want to close up with what I think was most important about how Kevin did it right. I alluded to this before, but his kindness, it was quiet. It was not show-offy. His conscience. This guy was a giant, right? He was just a giant, and yet he was the guy who said, you're going to look after that person you might not have thought about. And you saw that because there are people who will tell you that they're alive today because of the counseling that Kevin gave them. He devoted himself to leukemia research. He would drag all of us out to the Pineapple Classic, which raised money for leukemia research. My wife told me a story tonight about how when she had a complicated negotiation with some kind of art gallery on some gun safety thing in Louisiana, Carrie just said, you talk to Kevin, and Kevin, of course, did the negotiation. So most of us are going to live longer lives than Kevin did. But I'm not sure that's the standard by which we measure our lives or anyone's life. Kevin lived deep, and he lived well. And I just hope while we may have more time on this planet than Kevin did, we should all strive to live with the depth and the richness and the integrity that Kevin did. And Kevin, I'm going to miss you just 3 miles down the road. But rest easy, friend, because from here on out, we've got the watch.
Thanks a lot, Himes. I think you got that just right. So I'm going to tell another story now. This is about the time of my wedding. Just a quick one. So I got married in Hawaii, and my wife Aki's Japanese. So we had about half the people were coming from Japan and half were coming from the U.S. and most from the East Coast of the U.S. And that's about a 12-hour time difference. Well, before that, even so, at Kevin's best man speech, he actually referred to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that's entirely another story. If you want to hear that told well with just a little truth to it, the kernel of truth there, you want to talk to Mark Schoeffel. But this story is about what happened after the reception. So it's about midnight. Most of the guys from the States, all my friends were pretty worn out. For them, it was 6 o'clock in the morning. Now the Japanese friends of my wife and I they thought it was about 6 o'clock at night. So they are ready to go. And, as will happen, festivities went to the pool and the hot tubs of the hotel. And the only American that was still awake was Kevin. And he was, had as much energy as these Japanese guys. Now, maybe to sort of make up for his Pearl Harbor comment, he decided he was going to convince the Japanese guys in the hot tub that it's a custom, a tradition in America to remove the swimsuit and hide it of the groom. So and of course they didn't speak English very well, so it took a long time to negotiate that. But he got them all to rip my swimsuit off. It was lost for quite a while. And I think some of them probably think that really is the tradition in the United States. But so that's my Kevin, the last American awake at my wedding story. Next, we got Mark Schoeffel, another guy who rode with Kevin and Hubbard and has known him for 35 plus years. So Mark.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. Carrie, Jane, Nell, Mr. and Mrs. Cameron, and Karen. Let me begin by saying I'm so very deeply sorry for the loss of your husband, your son, father, and brother, Kevin. When I thought about what I would say today, briefly, I decided I would read to all of you a letter that I recently wrote to Kevin, but I never sent it. Before I read it, I did come across a quotation from Ted Hughes, a poet who wrote to his son a letter, and he said these words, "Live as all your ancestors were living again through you." And they're words I think Kevin understood as he lived. So here goes. Dear Kevin, sometimes when I was in my 30s, soon after you began to undergo your treatments, I would get on the rowing machine or be on the water. And when I would get tired, I would think of you. We get voices in our heads, not just in rowing, but in life. And often they lie to us. Well, you never spoke to me. Instead, I would just see an image of you in the rain. Just before we were about to race Yale one year, you let out what could only be termed as a primal scream. It was uncharacteristic of you, Kevin. And also, right before the race began, we all just felt it in our bones. It was a cry of joy, even pride and belief. And it radiated through us that day. So Kevin, I found strength then and again through you. As I think back, as we become older, we all need to learn to bear up. But I want to say to you that your example meant something to me. It's been one of total commitment to life, and most of all to your family. And you have emboldened and humbled me. Few of us have had to face the greatest mortal challenges. You faced yours sooner and for so many years with dignity and courage. I remember you telling me about your first diagnosis and treatment many years ago. You never embellished, you didn't dwell on it. You just presented the facts and you moved us on. That was your way. You bore things on those big shoulders. Perhaps you learned it from your parents, strong people. Don't make a fuss or complain. But like the Washington-bred youth you are, you just always dug in and pulled in the toughest tests. No shortcuts, you seem to say without speaking it. Your resolve said simplicitly, you need to endure and be stubborn and iron-willed when faced with a challenge. You looked it all in the eye, Kevin, and through pains and fears that I cannot fathom, you bore yourself headlong into that storm and pushed into the light and the darkness. So, back to how I see you, Kev. Not only a figure in the rain, stoic, on the gray Connecticut Thames River, with shadows of submarines passing us as we surged into a literal storm, feeling the sensation of each other and believing, pulling, just being together. Also, Kevin, I think about your stride, that bearing you had, your own race pace. It was never quite a sprint, always a long haul where the bullish heart of heart are most tested and come through. You in silence, behind your friend Tom, you guys ever intertwined, even in boats. And somehow your reliable strength of spirit just embodies the way you inspire us, Kevin. And the way that day you moved us, a stormy day back in June, I think 1986. And your expression on the dock, soaked, satisfied, yet at peace. That day, Kevin, you were very much at home in the aftermath, spent and strong and very much yourself. After the broil and the battle, the release and the smile. A great word for you, Kev, release and that smile. I mentioned that the long race was yours for the taking. Oh, it was. Knowing you, Kevin, you might not have told your daughters some things you did so exceptionally well, since you were never one to brag. But almost no one could compete with you on a very long, low-rate ergometer piece of some distance. And Kevin, that says so much about who you are at the core. My friend, you're deeply committed, you're fiercely loyal, and steady through each long stroke. In fact, I recall many pieces against faster crews in practice and in some JV or varsity battles when we were in the third quarter and our tanks were mostly empty. And I could just look down as I wavered, weary, or moved to falter, and I saw your back, that big, long torso, swinging towards me, unwavering, shuddering somewhat, but like a tachometer, precisely there and on point. You, Kevin, were never to be denied. And then, so too, I would strive to meet your standard and try to lay everything out there, to give my best and meet your mark. Yeah, Kevin, you moved boats, but in life, you moved people. I never doubted you. So I've got to finish, Kev. Your will, your body, and spirit have been mightily tested as you battled this illness. We did not see each other much these years. When we did, you lifted me up and others. You clearly and simply believed. Steve used to say to us sometimes in that way of his, believe. And I've told them sometimes that his unshaken belief in others, it made me believe more in myself. Kevin, I haven't said this to you, but you never say it. You just live the word believe. You did it with your life and your undying faith that you will live to not just breathe, but to embrace another day. So I thank you for that. In closing, Kev, as I think about all that you've had to navigate, I can't fathom how you've stayed this course, but I am sure of a few things. I know your devotion to your family could have only grown stronger. You've stood in the storm for them, unbowed. Your wife, Carrie, your girls, Jane and Nell. You stuck with them. They're your pride. And when we've talked, you just beam when you hear their names said. I imagine they know that they are lucky to have a father and husband who stoically got up each day with them always on his mind and heart, no matter what was facing him, and never putting himself first. And I bet they, like I, appreciate that under all that strength is a soul who truly embraces release and full-throated laughter as the spice of life. You always go in, Kev. You go all in. And you go with no limits when it comes to loyalty and laughter. At weddings, fast food runs, even a bachelor party, you often brought down the house in style. Boy, you can throw a bachelor party. But that was you, Kev. You knew it was right to go the extra step, even if in the moment it might be a bit of a risk, and you'd take it. In fact, Kevin, you risked everything for others. You never balked at taking a chance. As your friend, I find strength in writing to you now, and I'm grateful to hold you in my heart. I love you, man.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I know some non-rowers get a little tired of hearing rowers talk about rowing, but I think we all understand that's a little, he was talking about a little more than just rowing there. So as we come towards the end of this service, we'll have one more roommate, Adrian Blake, will be talking. And after his remarks, we'll go straight into the slideshow. You can watch again. And then we will, as I said, keep the Zoom open so people can continue if you want to leave messages for Kevin's family or chatting amongst yourselves. It'll be up for probably another half hour at least. So I wanted to read something, just a short bit from an obituary for Kevin that's being put together. It's not done yet, but I just want to read a small piece of it. As a consequence of his diagnosis, Kevin became an expert in navigating the often confusing world of clinical care and insurance coverage. After retiring from professional life, he spent much of his time working with others who were unfortunate enough to be diagnosed with cancer. He shared his hard-won wisdom broadly and tirelessly. So that, this is something that, I didn't even know. Some people have mentioned it tonight, but I didn't even know everything that Kevin was doing on this front. Helping others with that hard-earned experience. And I don't think anybody knows really the true extent of all that he was doing. He spent countless hours, and he'd worked for months on people's cases to make sure they got insurance or got to see the right doctors. And a lot of time while he was doing that, obviously he was still, dealing with his own medical issues. So when he and I would talk over the years, this kind of came up. A few of these stories would come out, but always as sort of a tangent to something else, like something about insurance generally, and he'd have an example based on somebody he'd helped. I think if we were to add all that he did, add it all up, and look at the sum of how much he did for other people, I'm sure it would just be an astounding amount. Again, I don't think anybody knows the full extent of it. Just because Mark mentioned he was humble. He was humble, and he didn't talk about it that often. Just one example I didn't know about. He spent a lot of time helping our college crew coach Harry Parker when he was diagnosed with cancer, and he never even mentioned that to me. So that's something he ever talked about. Just quietly and persistently did it a lot. It's just part of the legacy of an amazing guy. So now, as I hand off to Adrian, I'll just say there's never been a better friend, and I'll miss him. Adrian.
Thank you, Tom. There's going to be a toast at the end of this, so you may want to have a drink ready. Jane Austen once said, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that the Irish are better than the Scottish." At least I'm pretty sure it was Jane Austen. Kevin had a lot of problems during his life. He was short. He was fat. Obese, really, if we're being honest. And he was really not very bright. I mean, as thick as two short planks nailed together. Hardly athletic. Never really worked that hard. He gave up so easily. His wife wasn't very good looking, a real failure professionally, and not many friends. That's a full plate. But of all these, the worst burden that he had to carry was the shame of being Scottish. I'm blessed enough to have Irish parents and to have grown up about 20 minutes from the Harvard campus. So Kevin and our other roommates spent a good bit of time with my family. We tried to convert him to the Irish side, and my parents from Dublin certainly put in the hours through countless meals at our house and at the Cape during college and after college. If we had more time, I would tell you the Irish coffee story, but to no avail. Now, this is important because the song I would like to sing for you has been claimed by the Irish and the Scottish. The Scottish think it's theirs, but they're wrong. As far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I'm right, all Scottish songs are about haggis, except for Auld Lang Syne, which is about being cold and wet. This song is called The Parting Glass, and it's about an old tradition in the days of horseback. The parting glass was the final hospitality offered to a departing guest. At the end of the evening, once they had mounted their horse, they were presented one final drink to fortify them for their travels. The singer has the perspective of someone who's had a full life and has to go away now, but is celebrating all the things that made that life beautiful. He's sorry to go, but he had a great time. It's traditional at Irish funerals and memorials because it doesn't deny the sorrow of someone going away, but it remembers the things that brought meaning to their life. It's even been done by Ed Sheeran, but he's English and nobody likes them at all. And even though Kevin was regrettably short, fat, and stupid, I'd like to think he would agree with these sentiments. Of all the money that e'er I spent it in good company. And all the harm that e'er I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night, and joy be with you all. Oh, all the comrades that e'er I had, they are sorry for my going away. And all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they would wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and softly call, good night, and joy be with you all. If I had money enough to spend and leisure time to sit a while, there is a fair maid in this town that sorely has my heart beguiled. Her rosy cheeks and ruby lips, I own she has my heart in thrall. Then fill to me the parting glass. Good night, and joy be with you all. Then fill to me the parting glass. Good night, and joy be with you all. To Kevin, he was fucking special.